So good afternoon everyone, it's 3 o'clock, it's Monday. Welcome to Joe and Mike's award-winning virtual tours. And we're here back in the beautiful Linlithgow. We're at the palace. So we're going to take a little walk around the grounds here outside of the Linlithgow Palace and talk about a wee bit more about the characters. You cannot come to Linlithgow Palace and not talk about Mary Queen of Scotland. So let's move over to this beautiful statue of Mary. Mary was born here. Quite possibly one of the most romantic, if not tragic, characters in Scottish history. So she was born here in 1542. Her mother was Mary de Guise. Her father was James V. James V died when Mary was only a week old. Now, we don't know if he died because he got the news of a big defeat at the Battle of Solway down in England. We don't know if it was because of that, because if he had a nervous reaction, or if he actually died through some bad water that he had drunk. But the story is that when he was lying in his deathbed, he found out that his wife had given birth to a daughter, and he said about the whole Stuart dynasty, well, it came with a lass and it'll go with a lass, which meant, going back to the start of the Stuart dynasty, we had Marjorie Bruce, the daughter of Robert the Bruce, who married the Stuarts. The crown then went over to the Stuarts and continued on. Now, James V thought that the whole of the Stuart dynasty would end with Mary. It didn't. It actually ended with Anne, who was still part of the Stuart dynasty, but that was a couple of hundred years later from Mary. So it did. His prediction was correct. If he actually said that, and if we hold that as true, his prediction was right. It did come with a lass, and it did leave with a lass, but it didn't leave with Mary. In fact, Mary's story is quite interesting. I want to show you this lovely statue here. You can see the statue. She's holding her Bible, very, very religious woman. She stuck to her Catholic faith when she came back here from France. She's holding the crucifix, which is a symbol of the Catholic Church as well. I'll talk a wee bit more as we walk around. I won't go into too much detail, but we will tomorrow go into a lot more detail. But I want to show you this wonderful statue here of Mary Queen of Scots. You cannot come here to Linlithgow and not talk about Mary Queen of Scots, or Mary Stuart, Marie Stuart. I'll point out some of the detail at the base here. You can see her Bible up here. That's in her left hand. Her right hand, she's holding up the crucifix. At the bottom of the base, you see both have French connections and a Scottish connection. We have the fleur de lis, and we have the thistle, the emblems of Scotland and the emblems of France there. So she became Queen of Scots when she was only about a week old. Her mother, Mary de Guise. Now, a bit more about Mary. She had lots of half-brothers and sisters because her father was a bit profligate in his affairs with different women in Scotland. She was the only surviving legitimate child of James V, hence the crown went to Mary, even though she has some older brothers and sisters, half-brothers and sisters. The crown went to Mary when she was but a child. And one of the agreements that they wanted between Scotland and England, because when Mary was born, we have to remember that Henry VIII was the king in England. Now, Mary was the great niece of Henry VIII. So Mary's grandmother, it all gets very complicated, Mary's grandmother was Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor was the sister of Henry VIII. So there's lots of blood relations. So this played against Mary in many respects, because Mary had both Tudor blood and Stuart blood. So royal blood was coursing through her veins, and this became a big threat later on when she started to grow up. There was an agreement signed between the Scots and the English that Mary would be betrothed to Henry's first son. However, the Scottish Parliament pulled out of this one with pressure from some of the Catholic cardinals here. The Scots pulled out. Of course, this didn't go down well with Henry. So Henry decided to invade Scotland. And the invasion, or the war, was known as the War of the Rough Wooing. And so Mary was taken from here, from Linlithgow, up to Stirling and further up north for her own protection, and eventually was taken over to France to stay with the de Guise family. So she didn't stay in Scotland very long, but she grew up speaking Scots and speaking French. She didn't actually speak English that well, surprisingly enough, but she spoke fluent Scots, because Scots was the official language. And she ended up in France. But let's take a little bit further around here. From Michael, I'm going to show you some of the beautiful views you get here in Linlithgow, and I'll talk about Mary as we go along. But a wonderful statue here. Now the palace itself, people get asked the question, what's the difference between a palace and a castle? Well, a castle was normally built for defensive purposes, but a palace was more for luxury. And so this was an actual palace. And as Mary was born in here, and when Mary came back to Scotland, there's a big jump here, but when Mary came back to Scotland, she also lived here. And the gardens that we're walking around here were known as the pleasure gardens. And we'll go over here and we'll give you a little panorama so you can see, because the whole palace is situated in beautiful grounds. And they would have falconry here, they would play games here, they would have all the leisure activities, and they would have beautiful laid out, wonderful gardens back in those days. But if we pan around, Mike, and you might be able to pick out the loch that's here as well. This is Linlithgow Loch. Now, the loch itself is a site of special scientific interest, so it's a triple SI. You can get licensed to fish in here as well if you're a local. They do boating on here and they do sailing on it. So it continues that pleasure palace aspect that Linlithgow was known for. And it's from this angle here, once you've done the loch, we can pan around again. Just see the beautiful countryside just over there, this other side here. And there's also a spectacular view of St. Michael's Church. St. Michael is the patron saint of Linlithgow. Beautiful, beautiful. And I like the people always comment on this spire. The spire is very modern. Put back on there in the 1960s. The church is still active. And we're going to talk more about the church in our webinar tomorrow as well. A little bit more about Mary. So Mary went over to France and she grew up in the royal court with the de Guise family. The de Guise family were a very important family. Her mother was manoeuvred her way into being Queen Regent here. So she was a regent queen while Mary was a child over in France. Mary got betrothed to the young crown prince, or the Dauphin, in France. And when the king died, the young prince became king himself, and Mary became the queen consort. So not only was she Queen of Scotland, she was also queen consort in France. So Scotland and France were actually united, and secretly Mary had signed some agreements with the French to say that when she inherited Scotland and when she inherited even the English throne, that would all come under the French aspect of it. So she was making these treaties with the French and the Scots and the English. Mary always had a claim to the English throne, and she never really gave that up. And this is where the threat came with Elizabeth. And this goes back to the Tudor blood that she carried, because Elizabeth was always considered to be the bastard queen. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And remember, Anne Boleyn got her head chopped off. And when Henry VIII died, and then went to his daughter Mary, and then when Mary died, and then went to Elizabeth. Now, Mary Queen of Scots, different from Mary in England. Mary in England was known as Bloody Mary. Guess that's where we get the drink from, huh? Bloody Mary. And she is very different from Mary Queen of Scots and Mary Stuart. They're very different. Then after about a year of marriage, or a year of being a queen in France, the young prince developed an ear infection, which led to a tumour in his brain, and the young king of France died. So she was a queen consort that left Mary without any husband, as her first one went, without a husband, and also, because she was queen consort, the title did not pass to her, the title passed to the younger brother, so it went from Francis down to Charles. So Mary was left without a crown in France, but she still had the crown here. There's a good little picture here, you might want to pick this up. It gives you a good perspective on the palace, what it would have looked like with its royal wash on it, because these palaces really stood out. You can see the lime covering on here, and you can see the way the pleasure gardens are laid out down here. It gives you a bit of an artist's impression. The park that we're sitting in is known as the Peel, P-E-E-L. I think that comes from an old French word for stake.
Yes.
For a stake in the ground?
Yeah, something to do with like stockade, P-E-L-E or
P
something?
P-E-L-E, yeah, so no French word, so it's
Yeah,
translated into Peel for Scots. I
Yeah.
believe that's the origin or the etymology of it. So Mary was left as a young widow in France, and in the meantime, back in Scotland, the country had been going through this change, this convulsion, going from a Catholic country into a Protestant country, and civil war was breaking out in various places. So Mary was not welcome back in Scotland, but she really had no choice. They did try to look for other husbands for her in Europe. So the prince in Spain was considered, but he was actually probably just as weak as the French one, so that got nowhere. So she finally decided to come back here to Scotland with her entourage. Indeed, there is still a place in Edinburgh which we still refer to as Little France, and this is where Mary and her entourage camped when they came back to Scotland. Very neat. We've already done a video on Craigmillar Castle. So Mary came back, lived in Craigmillar, while the entourage lived in the Little France area. So Mary came back to a country that didn't really want her. Came back to her mother had died in the meantime. Protestantism, or the Reformation, was on the growth. She came back here. She had difficulties with her half brother, the Earl of Murray. The Earl of Murray initially supported her, and the Earl of Murray actually went over to France for the wedding, but he had become Protestant and saw the difficulties, and so there was already a schism between the royals here, and the Earl of Murray always had his eye on the throne himself. So they were desperately looking for a new husband for Mary back here. Queen Elizabeth was recommending some people to marry, but the one she chose was Lord Darnley. Now, Darnley himself came from a Scottish aristocratic family, but they had lands in England, and he was also Catholic, and it was considered to be a love match to begin with. Mary would not make him king, though. He was king consort, but he was not king royal, and this really upset Lord Darnley. So after about a year of marriage, Mary fell pregnant. The relationship became very tempestuous. Darnley was considered to be a narcissist. He was considered to be, actually you can say, quite brutal in the way of the relationship with Mary. When Mary was pregnant, he tried to make her, well, when he said tried to make her lose the baby, there's so many events happened while she was pregnant. You would wonder how she would manage to hold on to her baby. And one of the events that happened was that he was very jealous of Mary's Italian secretary, and there were rumours actually that the male secretary was actually the father of the baby, but that was the rumours in those days. And one evening when Mary was heavily pregnant, they were in Holyrood Palace, and Darnley with his henchmen burst into the room, grabbed Rizzio, the Italian secretary, and murdered him in front of her. Not a very nice thing to do to your wife, was it? Darnley then sort of escaped over to the west for a little while and went to live in his own lands. He got very ill. People say that he actually possibly had syphilis. He was apparently a very handsome man, and he was one for the ladies. And he was over in the west and was convinced to come back over to Edinburgh because Edinburgh had the best physicians of the day. So he was brought back to Edinburgh. He was put into a house near Holyrood. And then one evening, Mary went to visit him. And she was visiting while he was in recuperation. She left because she was going to a wedding ceremony or celebrations for one of her ladies-in-waiting back in the palace. And as she was on her way back, the whole house that Darnley was in exploded. However, when they found the bodies, there was no evidence of scorch marks or anything to do with the explosion. In fact, it was thought that he was suffocated. They found his equerry, and the equerry had been strangled. One of the men who was implicated in this murder was Lord Bothwell. Bothwell was another character who had his eyes on Mary, eyes on power, and again, another narcissistic in many regards. To cut a long story short, he abducted Mary while Mary was travelling between two of her palaces. She got abducted. Some say she was actually raped by Bothwell. She then married Bothwell, and this is when the touch paper touched the firework, and the whole thing went up. This is when the Civil War really broke out. Bothwell was put on trial, but he got off with it. Now, the nobles of Scotland did not appreciate Mary's involvement in this. They did not appreciate that she was marrying Bothwell, and so civil war erupted. Mary was held captive for a while in Scotland here. She was forced to abdicate to her young son. So she had a son, James VI. She was forced to abdicate for the young son. So all the accoutrements of state were taken for her. So she lost not only France, she's now lost Scotland. So she's lost both countries. Sad story. She was then held captive further north in a tower on an island in a loch, and she was held there for almost a year. She managed to escape. She rallied some troops, and the final battle was against her half-brother, the Earl of Murray, and that was in Langside over in the west, Scotland. Defeat was on the cards, and she decided to escape to England. Now, why did she not escape to France is a question that's always been left there. But she escaped down to England, and there's that old expression, you cannot have two queens in the same beehive, and so Mary was taken into captivity. She was held in captivity for almost 19 years before she was implicated all the way through her captivity in conspiracy theories, and her half-brother sent a casket of letters here from Scotland down to her persecutors there, and in it, they don't know if the letters were genuine or not, but in there the letters about how she was conspiring against, either with Darnley, against Elizabeth. Some of the people say the letters were forgeries, other people, historians still say no, they're quite true, but who knows. But it wasn't until later on when she was actually fully implicated in a conspiracy theory. It was called the Throgmorton Papers, and Mary met her match and was finally beheaded at Fotheringay Castle. So she lost France, she lost Scotland, she lost the crown of Scotland, she lost the crown of France, she lost her son, and she lost her head. Is there anything more tragic that you can think of in the life of a young woman? So she was 45 years old when she died. 19 years kept in captivity in England, 1 year in captivity here in Scotland. When we say captivity, though, we don't think of her in a prison cell. There are stories of her going to Buxton to the spa and the whole thing, so she did get out and about and meet other people. But just a wee bit more about the building itself, I'm going to pass over to Mike. Mike's going to give you a bit more detail about the building. We will go into a bit more detail tomorrow. That was a very, very brief and annotated version of the life of Mary. I always think that Mary got the last laugh, though. I always say Mary got the last laugh. And I always think of Mary with the head chopped off, with the ruff going up here, and her head and her armpit here, laughing, because it was her son, James VI, who then did get the crown, and he did inherit the English crown. So everything that Mary had said about she was always going to take over the English crown actually came true. So her son, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, and the Stuart dynasty continued for at least another 100-odd years with countries united. So the countries united, early 1600s, Scotland and England united under the one crown, and it was the Stuart crown. Something that the Tudors could hardly do, because they could never get control of Scotland. Even when Margaret Tudor married into the Stuarts, it was still the Stuart dynasty. And so the Stuarts took over the English throne. Yay! So I'm going to pass you over to Mike. Mike's going to talk more about the building and the palace itself. Hope you enjoyed that.
Beside this huge building, which has got very thick walls, and sometimes if I was to go inside here, we might be losing the signal. So just a wee bit of a recap on the palace here. It was built at different times in its history, and there was an earlier building here, a castle, going back to times of David II. There was a building here in the 13th century. And in about 1425 there was a huge fire, and what was known as Linlithgow Castle, or even a mansion house for the accommodation of the monarchs, it was destroyed, so they had to have something else. So James I, he started building this from the Great Hall End, which is the eastern side, but we'll show you inside the building on the webinar and explain that, but we can appreciate the exterior here. I'd like you to notice the effect of musket balls on the exterior. You can see these indentations because this was attacked in the 1650s by one Oliver Cromwell, who was Lord Protector, who was creating a republic, having killed King Charles I in 1649. It went 10 years without a monarch in place as such, although there was a claimant who was King Charles II. And talking about King Charles I, who was executed 1649 by Cromwell, he was the last monarch to have spent a night here in 1633. They weren't expecting him just to stay a night. They thought he would stay much longer than that, but they had to clear out the keeper, the person who was in charge looking after the building, and make it all clean and elegant. And almost all of Linlithgow, the people of Linlithgow were called in to clear away the mouse droppings, the rat droppings, the infestations, the cobwebs, and give it a good old going over for one night's stay by King Charles I in 1633. It has been described by various people. It was described by Robert Burns as a rather magnificent but melancholy ruin. So it is very splendid but melancholy at the same time. We can just think of the passage of time and the scars that this building holds. Not just the musket balls, but it hasn't got a roof, as you can see as well. It was occupied by Cromwell. Cromwell burnt it. He, of course, didn't believe in any trappings of monarchy, so he was going to destroy it. It was like an army garrison location, and they were lighting open fires in the courtyard and all sorts of things. Huge destruction.
Thank you, Oliver.
You can see.
Big thank you to Oliver Cromwell.
Yes, thanks to Oliver Cromwell. And you can notice sometimes from the stonework, if we look at the bottom here, that there was an earlier period of building. Now we're talking about the 15th century when this was being built, from about 1425, 26 it started. And then as various other monarchs succeeded, then they would change things, change the accommodation. And if you look at the big tall windows up here, you may see a different type of stonework where the stone is a bit more regular and looks as if it's been shaped and worked on, whereas down below it looks a bit more ragged, and down below is older than what you've got up the top, because up the top is more like late 15th century, early 16th century, but then below here you've got early 15th century. So there's all sorts of different periods, but once again we'll talk about that on the webinar. This is St Michael's Church. This was built in the 15th century, and if you were a monarch, it was believed that you were given that position by God, and you had to have the house of God close by your pleasure palace. So a church was intrinsic to a royal community, and that's what we have, St Michael's Church. And remember the motto of Linlithgow. St Michael's motto is welcoming visitors with kindness. Now we go close in a bit more. We're going into the shade, but I hope you can still follow us and see what we're going to point out. This doorway here would be for the access of the monarch and the monarch's family. And looking closely, you can see what we were talking about at Duddingston Church, the ancient church of Duddingston that went back to the 13th century. Well, we've got similar decoration in this Romanesque, what we would call Norman arch. It is not pointed, it is curved. And we've got these floral patterns, and these are really ancient. This goes back to the 15th century, what you're seeing here. But if you go to the right, you can see there's been some restoration done there. And there's little bits of symbolism too, and I think we've got a tree here. And we've got the motto of Linlithgow, which was to do with the greyhound, the black bitch, the tree, the island, the tree that dog was chained to. So I am speculating, but I think that is symbolic of that story. The windows with the bars, these were the prisons and cellars, and famously used in Outlander, again, if you follow that series. And they are very dark and foreboding in there, and you can really picture how it must have been going back to the 15th century for prisoners, people incarcerated in these dark, cold interiors. Linlithgow Loch we've talked about. Linlithgow Loch is the biggest stretch of fresh water in the Lothians, enclosed fresh water, and it's a site of special scientific interest also, and it's alive with wildlife. I think Joe was talking about that early on. There are the remains of 2 crannogs there. Now, crannogs were little man-made islands which were connected to the land by causeways, wooden causeways, and they would be bases for hunting and fishing, and also staying protected. And there are only 2 of these, and we can actually see one of them over there in the distance if you look over there.
You might want to spell crannog for
Crannog. Crannog is C-R-A-N-N-O-G. And crannogs go back 5,000 years, would you believe, back to Neolithic times for the early farmers. So amazing history, ancient history in the landscape here in Linlithgow Loch. Linlithgow, the name Linlithgow, is one interpretation of it, is loch by the damp hollow. We don't have lakes in Scotland, it's lochs, L-O-C-H, so that's the connection there. So what we've got here is the east side of the palace, and this interior here is some of the oldest interiors that we will see when we do the interior view, and what we call these great buttresses with towers or bartizans. These were to give added defence. They were like little gun towers, little lookout towers, but in this case they were also supporting the wall of the palace, because even going back to about the 16th century, the walls were beginning to show their age and they needed an extra bit of support. So these were put here by James IV, who was the monarch during that time. And we've got all these humps in the landscape too. And this is beautiful, beautiful areas to walk around here, around Linlithgow Palace.